Today, we're going over the greatest rivalry in human history. It's the latter half of the 12th century, and in the fragmented chaos of the Middle East, the Crusaders living in the Holy Land have entered into an uneasy truce with the Muslim rulers in the area. Things are tense for the Christians in this strange world, but thanks to the ceasefire, they're able to live in relative peace while planning their next movements. But everything changes in 1187 when a rogue crusader prince named Renaud breaks the truce and begins attacking Muslim caravans. This act of unprovoked aggression simply cannot go unpunished, and the Ayyubid Sultan, a man named Saladin, sets a trap for the Crusaders and he lures them into the Battle of Hattin, where he delivers the most crushing defeat the Christians will ever experience in the Middle East. At Hattin, Saladin executes Renaud himself and captures one of the most holy relics in all of Christianity, a fragment of the true cross, the very cross Jesus was crucified on, as his prize. Weeks later, he goes on to recapture Jerusalem, and he begins planning to permanently remove all Christians from the land. Back in Europe, the Pope issues a call for a third crusade to reclaim the Holy City, and kings from the greatest Christian empires begin to take up the cross. Around this time, a young prince named Richard I betrays his father and becomes the King of England. With his throne secured, he joins the crusade and sets his sights on his next glorious conquest, the reclaiming of the true cross and the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. And so in 1191, Richard and his army set sail for the Middle East. He has no idea that soon he'll be locked in a deadly life-or-death showdown against the most formidable foe he has ever faced. The stage is set for the greatest rivalry in the history of mankind, a legendary warrior king versus a genius tactical strategist. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. In 1189, following the fall of Jerusalem, Crusaders in the Holy Land began a siege on the Muslim port city of Acre. The fighting is fierce, with both the Christians and Muslims fully understanding the importance of the city, and momentum swings back and forth daily. Eventually, the Muslim defenders are cut off from their supply lines, and they offer to surrender peacefully, but the Crusaders, hoping for a glorious victory, deny their requests. But the tides of war shift when Saladin arrives with his army. He quickly surrounds the once confident Crusaders, and now they're forced to deal with constant attacks from the city walls in front of them and horse archers sent in by Saladin in their rear. This stagnant double siege situation drags on for a year, and the Crusaders outside the city and the Muslim defenders inside the city begin to starve. The winter of 1190 is brutal, and many of the Christians begin to die from sickness and starvation. It seems the campaign at Acre is headed for failure, and they pray to God to save them. And their prayers are answered in the spring of 1191 when King Philip of France arrives, quickly followed by his frenemy, the newly crowned King Richard of England. Sensing victory is near, the Crusaders celebrate the arrival of the kings, until they see that they're both super sick from their journey and can't fight just yet.
Since I must rest, I shall let my mind wander the vast and mystical archives that lie beyond mortal sight. You there, bring me the royal personal computer. I wish to access the World Wide Web.
Sire, before you log into that public Wi-Fi, you should probably turn on PIA VPN.
Ha! A lion hath no need for shadows. Let my foes come if they dare, for I shall smite them openly.
Access denied.
What villainous trickery is this? Show thyself, cowardly rogue!
See, what Richard didn't understand is that when you're browsing online, you're basically broadcasting your data to everyone on the internet. It doesn't matter whether you're using a phone, tablet, or PC, hackers, your ISP, or even the government could be collecting personal information like your IP address, usernames, and even photos. One of the best ways to prevent this is using Private Internet Access VPN. It'll mask your IP address and open up an encrypted tunnel that keeps all of your online activity private. PIA VPN will never log your data, and they've proven this multiple times in court and through third-party audits. But that's not all. PIA also allows you to change your IP address to regions across the world to get access to content that may be blocked where you are.
I use it to watch anime in Japan. It's super sugoi.
For serious history viewers, Private Internet Access is offering an amazing deal of 83% off. This comes out to just around $2.03 a month, and you can use one account to keep all of your devices safe. To get this deal and to help support our channel, click the link in the description below or go to piavpn.com/serioushistory. Using our link will also get an additional 4 months of service completely free. Signing up for it is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee.
Let it be known across the land, Private Internet Access is the true champion of privacy.
Well said, King Richard. Now, could you please get back into bed so we can continue your story?
Oh, yes, certainly.
While rolling around sick in bed, King Richard sends his first message to Saladin.
Dear Saladin, I, Richard I, King of England, and soon all of France as well, request your presence to discuss your surrender of Acre and our holy city of Jerusalem. Oh, and also, can you, send some fruit, please, because I'm feeling quite ill. Thanks!
What the fuck? Saladin sends the fruit, but he rejects the meeting, insulted that some kid who's half his age is treating him like an equal. A month goes by, and Philip finally recovers, and he begins his assault on the city in early July. His siege engines pepper Acre's walls, and the defenders signal to Saladin that they may not last much longer. Saladin responds by ordering his men to increase their attacks on the Crusaders, but Philip's presence at Acre seems to have been just what the Crusaders needed to finally take the city. And it's at this point in the story where we really begin to see just what kind of person Richard was. See, he's still super sick, but he can't stand the thought of Philip getting all the glory, so he sets up his own massive catapults, which were named, and I quote, God's Own Catapult and the Bad Neighbor, and he begins firing at the city to steal some of Philip's thunder. Richard then orders his men to carry him out on a stretcher near the front lines, and he begins shooting at the defenders with a crossbow while lying down, still looking half dead. The combined Crusader forces break through the city walls, and the defenders desperately plead for Saladin's help. The Muslims in Acre mount one final defense on July 11th, but by the next day, the city was captured, and the Christians take the defenders hostage. Richard sets the terms for the surrender. He wants Saladin to return the True Cross, along with 200,000 gold pieces and 1,600 previously captured Christian prisoners. In exchange, they'll return their 2,700 captured defenders from Acre. Richard gives Saladin a deadline and waits. King Philip and some other lords, having checked Go Crusading off their bucket list, return to Europe, leaving Richard to collect the spoils. But negotiations soon break down as both sides begin to demand their hostages be returned first, and Saladin ends up missing the deadline. This infuriates Richard, and he aims to send a message to the Sultan of the consequences of messing with the wrong dick. He has his men gather up the 2,700 Muslim prisoners, and he marches them up a hill called Ayadiyah. He orders his men to bound the prisoners and then begins beheading them in full view of Saladin's camp. Upon seeing the public execution of their brothers, Saladin's men charge up the hill to save them, but the Crusaders fight them off and force them to watch as they cut off the heads of each prisoner one by one until every single last one is dead. Saladin is enraged and in retaliation orders the immediate execution of his 1,600 Christian prisoners. An eye for an eye, and the rivalry that will make legends of the two men is off to a very disturbing start. With Acre secured, Richard begins to march his men towards the ruined city of Jaffa, which is about 80 miles away. His goal is to set up a string of fortresses that can be used to supply his men for their eventual push to Jerusalem. Saladin gets word from his scouts that Richard is traveling along this coastal path, and he begins planning an attack to wipe out Richard and the Crusaders before they reach the city. Now, Richard was arrogant, impulsive, and kind of a dick, but he was no idiot. He knew that extreme heat and lack of water were the key factors that led to the Crusaders' defeat at Hattin. So he has supply ships running the coast, constantly bringing his troops fresh water and supplies from Acre throughout their march. He also chose a path that allowed the sea to protect his flank. But unknown to Richard, Saladin watched the Crusaders from a distance, concealed in the wooded hills, waiting for the perfect time to strike. As Richard marched his men south, Saladin would periodically send his mounted archers out on hit-and-run attacks at vulnerable stretches of the road. The Christians are heavily armed and can defend against the light arrows, but these attacks take out their horses, and this slows them down. As Richard travels along the road, Saladin expertly moves his men in the cover of the woods, pacing with the Crusaders. Richard is oblivious to just how many Muslims are waiting in the shadows to attack him, until the morning of September 7th, 1191, when they near the ruined city of Arsuf. Richard is getting his men into formation to continue their trek when war drums and trumpets cut through the still morning air, and thousands of mounted archers screaming their battle cries begin to charge towards the Crusaders. The Christians look up to the wooded hills, and the full might of Saladin's army emerges from the shadows, and soon their numbers black out the horizon. Over 25,000 men. Richard's army is less than half the size at around 12,000. Like waves cresting over the hills, Saladin's archers swarm the Crusaders and launch a heavy barrage of arrows. The Crusaders defend themselves, but more of their horses and pack animals are killed. Richard commands his army to position themselves into a defensive formation and begin returning crossbow fire while continuing to move towards Arsuf. Saladin's army bears down on the Crusaders, and their march slows to a near standstill. Arrows continue to rain down on the Christians, and the Knights Hospitallers in the rear are getting the worst of it.
Richard, come on, bro, let us hold!
The young king carefully watches the movements of the Muslim soldiers, and he's suddenly stricken with terror as he realizes what the Sultan is trying to do.
My God, Saladin's tactics are designed to break our formation. If any part of our line retaliates, it will create a gap, and he will send cavalry into the opening. They will slaughter us from the inside out. The victory at Hattin was not a fluke. If I make a single mistake now, the cost will be the lives of every Christian.
Richard, bro, look, they shot more of our horses. Come on, man, you got less fight back. Hold!
The full force of the Muslim army bears down on the Crusaders, who are now pinned to a standstill and growing frustrated that Richard is holding them back. Sensing victory is at hand, Saladin rides behind his men, shouting words of encouragement over the drums, and the Muslims respond with increased ferocity. The archers begin to dismount and increase their rate of fire, and Richard and his men are completely trapped. Saladin's infantry then begin their march towards the Crusaders to finish them off. Seeing this, the Hospitallers again demand to charge, but Richard again instructs them to hold and wait for the signal.
This is some fucking bull. Yeah! Taste my steel, you dirty Saracen!
Oh, for f***'s sake. The Knights Hospitaller cannot take it anymore and break formation. They charge directly at the advancing Muslim force. More of the Crusaders follow their lead, and Richard realizes it's now or never. He had held his troops back as long as he could, and finally, he gives the signal for a full counterattack. The Crusaders' trumpets blare 6 times, and in unison, the Knights charge at full speed towards Saladin's men. The Muslims had been attacking the Crusaders for hours unanswered and had slipped into a false sense of security, and they're startled by the faces of the Christians who are now charging directly at them. Like tortured, caged animals who had finally been set free, the Crusaders roar and begin ruthlessly slaughtering Saladin's forces. Richard and his heavy cavalry smash into the archers, and in the blink of an eye, Saladin watches as his victory is snatched from his hands. He and his generals stand in disbelief as his men stream past them fleeing in terror. Richard is leading the cavalry from the front and engages personally in savage hand-to-hand combat. The Sultan regains his composure and sees that the Crusaders have lost themselves to bloodlust. He quickly comes up with a counter-strategy and orders a full retreat into the woods. If he can lure the Christians into the shadows, he can regroup his men and ambush them. The Muslims race into the cover of the trees with the Crusaders in hot pursuit, but just as they begin to charge blindly into the woods, Richard commands them to stop. The Christians, against all odds, manage to fight back their instincts to continue the chase and stop themselves just short of Saladin's trap. The Sultan watches from the shadows as his strategy is again defeated for the second time today, and he recognizes that King Richard will not be easily defeated like the Christians he had fought in the past. Richard loses around 700 men in the Battle of Arsuf, while Saladin loses around 7,000 in defeat. The Crusaders celebrate their victory and continue on towards Jaffa, unaware that their destination would become the stage for the epic final showdown between the two legendary commanders. Richard and the Crusaders make it to Jaffa and quickly work to repair the fallen city. Saladin's scouts report on the progress made by the Christians, and he realizes that Richard is trying to set up a string of supply stations to Jerusalem. If Richard is able to do this, defending the holy city against a well-fed and well-supplied army of Crusaders will be near impossible. The battle at Arsuf has shown the battlefield abilities of the Christian king, so Saladin changes his strategy from direct combat to sabotage. He's about to show Richard that there are levels to this game of war. Saladin begins by destroying every port city and town en route to Jerusalem, starting with Ascalon, Richard's logical next destination. He knows that this will do 2 things. It'll force Richard to spend more time and resources building their own staging areas, and he's banking that the Crusaders will grow frustrated by the delays. Just as planned, Richard spent months refortifying Ascalon and spent more time fixing the destroyed forts along the road to Jerusalem. As time passed, the Crusaders became increasingly frustrated by the lack of action. They came here to fight, not to work as laborers, and Saladin's plan is playing out exactly as he thought it would. Throughout the entire time Richard was setting up supply lines, Saladin continued his hit-and-run tactics, which sunk Crusader spirits even further, and soon some of the knights began to leave and head back to other Christian cities in the area. Richard finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. He knows he needs logistics for any chance of success, but none of the other Crusaders seem to get it. They want to fight. They want to take Jerusalem. So eventually, they force Richard to make 2 attempts to recapture the Holy City, once getting within 12 miles of their goal. But both times, he turns them around when he realizes the risks are far too great. Seeing Jerusalem with their own eyes and then having to turn around without even attempting to take it crushes the last bits of morale amongst the Crusaders. Richard pitches a plan to take Egypt to cut off Saladin's supply lines, but they've lost faith in his leadership and refuse. Ironically, the only person who seems to get him is Saladin, and this is where the dynamics between the 2 leaders starts to get very interesting. See, both Richard and Saladin had been sending envoys to each other this whole time, trying to come to some sort of an understanding, and through these interactions, both Richard and Saladin begin to see their enemy in a new light. Saladin would often send his brother Al-Adil as the chief negotiator, and he and Richard actually became really good friends. So much so that Richard even offers up a plan where Al-Adil marries his sister to create peace through marriage. He didn't bother to ask his sister for her input on this arrangement, but hey, I guess it was a nice gesture. Through his friendship with Al-Adil, Richard's feelings towards the Muslims begins to evolve. They're not the monsters people in Europe said they were. Al-Adil is f***ing cool, and his brother Saladin, well, he's a wise and honorable king. But he can't really say this stuff out loud to his men. The rest of the Crusaders don't really feel the same, and they're getting more and more pissed that Richard is still not leading them to retake Jerusalem. Oh, and to make matters even worse, remember his frenemy King Philip of France? Well, Richard gets word that back in Europe, that dickhead is now working on a plan with his own brother Prince John, aka the bad guy in Robin Hood, to steal his throne and his lands while he's away in the Middle East. F***ing fantastic. Ugh. Everything seems to be falling apart for Richard. Despite not losing a single battle against the Muslims, Saladin's strategy had worked perfectly, and he has him on the ropes. Now under immense pressure, Richard needs to wrap this crusade up quick, and he travels to Acre to rally the additional troops he needs. Saladin is notified by his scouts that Richard's away, and he finally sees the opportunity he had been waiting for this whole time. With Richard in Acre, Jaffa was left almost completely undefended, and if he were to capture the city, Richard would be forced to try to take it again. The Crusaders would revolt to this plan, and without an army, the king's time in the Holy Land would be done. A complete victory without even having to fight him on the battlefield. And so Saladin quickly moves his forces to Jaffa to deliver the knockout punch. On the morning of July 27, 1192, the defenders at Jaffa wake up to the sights and sounds of an enormous Muslim army outside their walls. Saladin wastes no time and orders a full-out assault on the city. The Christians quickly send off a messenger to Acre and pray that he'll reach Richard before it's too late. The defenders do their best to hold off Saladin, fighting bravely though massively outnumbered, but the walls are soon breached and the Muslims storm their way into the city within 3 days. Fighting breaks out on the streets and surviving Crusaders are driven back into the citadel. The exhausted messenger sent from Jaffa reaches Acre in record time and delivers the dire news to Richard. He quickly gathers as many men as he can find and they board ships to make a beeline back to Jaffa. He understands the stakes as well as Saladin. If he doesn't make it in time, everything he had worked so hard for over the past year and a half would be for nothing. They arrive at Jaffa on August 1st, but the Crusaders begin to hang their heads in defeat when they see Saladin's flags flying on the city walls. They're too late. But suddenly, in the distance, Richard sees a man frantically swimming towards their ship. They pull him up, and he turns out to be a priest who was in Jaffa at the time of the attack. He tells them that hope is not lost. The Christians still live and are in the citadel waiting for you. They're ready to fight on. And upon hearing this, Richard grabs a crossbow and his sword, jumps off the ship, and begins to wade toward the shore. The knights on board follow his lead, and together they fearlessly advance directly towards the Muslim camp outside the city. Richard reaches shore and he quickly unloads a crossbow bolt into the first Muslim he sees. He then draws his sword and rushes headfirst into Saladin's camp. The Crusaders, swords drawn, follow their king and they engage the shocked Muslims in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Saladin's men cannot believe the boldness of these knights, and Richard leads from the front, hacking and slashing his way towards the city walls. The banner of the Lionheart is carried into battle as more and more Crusaders follow Richard's lead and begin jumping off their ships and wading to shore. Richard and his initial strike force make it into the city and fighting breaks out on every street. The Christians in the citadel, hearing the sounds of combat, are startled from their stupor. They peer out and see the flag of King Richard flying in the wind and are filled with his courage. They pour out of the citadel and join their fellow crusaders in battle, now unafraid of death itself. Saladin is shocked and cannot believe what he's seeing. For a year, he had meticulously planned this battle. His execution was flawless. Jaffa had fallen, yet now his soldiers are desperately fleeing the city. He orders the rest of his men to retreat, and they regroup a few miles away. As night falls, the crusaders within the city have a brief moment of celebration. Against all odds, Richard has again led them to victory. But the king knows that the battle is not yet won. Saladin had bet everything on Jaffa, and he will strike again. It dawns on both leaders that the next battle will be the final round in their year-and-a-half-long slugfest, and this will take place on August 4th, 1192. After Richard's epic rescue of Jaffa, he quickly has his men prepare defenses for Saladin's eventual counterattack. He dismantles his ships to create barricades and prays that the reinforcements from the north traveling on foot will reach them in time for the final assault. But unknown to Richard, Saladin had expected those reinforcements and had already sent troops to cut them off. Most of the forces Richard was banking on never make it to Jaffa. Saladin knows he cannot delay forever. Eventually, the Crusaders will rally more troops, and by his estimates, his current army still outnumbers the Crusaders at least 2-1. So in the darkness of the early morning on August 4th, 1192, the Sultan moves his entire remaining force to the city. In the early morning sun, a crusader out on morning patrol catches the glint of armor in the distance, and Richard quickly mobilizes his men into a pre-planned defensive formation. They position lances into a menacing hedge to stop cavalry charges, and foot soldiers brace themselves, holding shields to deflect the coming storm of Muslim arrows. Richard then strategically places pairs of crossbowmen behind the shields. Saladin nervously arrives on the battlefield, but as he looks out at Richard's army, a grin creeps across his face. He counts no more than 2,000 men in total. He looks to Richard on his horse and counts less than 10 other mounted knights with him. The army he brought with him numbers around 15,000 soldiers. It seems God has finally chosen the victor for this year-long war. Saladin delays no further. War drums and trumpets signal the final round between Richard and Saladin, and his mounted archers begin racing towards the Crusaders. Richard's men steel themselves for the upcoming battle, and he gives the signal for his crossbowmen to let loose their first round of deadly bolts. Dozens of the Muslim archers are knocked off their horses, and the remaining riders are shocked to be greeted by an immediate second wave of bolts from the Crusaders. Richard had instructed his crossbowmen to fire in volleys. As one group shot, the other reloaded, and through this tactic, the Muslims are forced to deal with a steady stream of unrelenting projectiles every time they try to approach. The Muslims try to bait the Crusaders into a charge by faking a retreat, but after the first battle, Richard has regained the full trust of his men and no one takes the bait. The only things that chase the retreating Muslims are crossbow bolts that find their way into their backs. This goes on for hours, and both sides grow exhausted. The Christians from the constant loading and firing of their crossbows, and the Muslims from the constant dying. Though outnumbering the Crusaders 5-1, Saladin's men begin to wilt, and sensing his chance, Richard leads his small group of mounted knights into a full-blown charge, which is quickly joined by his infantry. After surviving hours of constant crossbow fire, the Muslims are exhausted and have lost their will to fight. They begin to run, and Richard leads the Crusaders in cutting down the Sultan's men as they attempt to flee. But just as victory seems all but secured, Saladin sends a group of his soldiers into the city. The Sultan's men quickly overrun the guards, and Richard is forced to pull a strike force from the battlefield and storm into the city to save the day again. Richard routs the Muslims in the city, and Saladin has lost all words. He had meticulously planned for every scenario, but it was not enough. Had he gone up against any other Christian knight, there would have been no chance of failure. But Richard was undeniably the greatest warrior he has ever witnessed. As the sun sets, the two exhausted armies pull back for the night. The Muslims had lost over 1,500 horses and 700 men, and the Crusaders had lost 2 but suffered many injuries in the battle. Richard had once again defeated Saladin in combat, but after a year and a half of constant fighting, the king's body finally hit its breaking point. At night, he breaks out into a debilitating fever that leaves him bedridden. Priests and other healers in the Crusader camp try their best to cure him, but Richard is so sick it looks like he might die. Saladin's scouts bring him the news, But instead of celebrating the coming death of his greatest enemy, Saladin is concerned.
It's not fair. A man who had proven himself to be invincible in battle is betrayed by his own body? It cannot be.
In some versions of this story, Saladin sends his personal doctor with cooling fruits and ice from the mountain to treat Richard. The Crusaders, desperate for help, allow the doctor to treat the king, and he begins to recover. Though they've spent over a year trying to kill each other, neither the king nor the sultan can deny the greatness of their enemy any longer. To Richard, Saladin was an honorable ruler, fair to his people and enemies alike. A great king and a worthy rival. And to Saladin, Richard was the bravest warrior he had ever seen. A man without equal on the battlefield, though he probably still didn't really trust him. And so, on September 2nd, 1192, the king and the sultan signed a truce now known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Under this agreement, Saladin was allowed to retain control of Jerusalem under the condition that Christians be allowed safe passage into the city. The Crusaders will be allowed to keep their coastal cities, and neither side will attack the other for 3 years. The Treaty of Jaffa officially ended the Third Crusade, and Richard leaves for Europe to go deal with his asshole brother and frenemy Philip. Now, what happens to Richard after he leaves the Holy Land could be an entire video all on its own, so we'll save that story for another day. But as for Saladin, exhausted from the fighting that had consumed his life for nearly 3 decades, he passes away less than a year later. But stories of the chivalrous Sultan make their way back to Europe, and nobles throughout the land are fascinated by the tales of his tactical brilliance on the battlefield and the kindness he shows not only to his people, but his enemies as well. A Christian king and a Muslim sultan finding understanding and respect for one another through a series of epic battles in the Middle Ages may sound like some Hollywood BS, but it really happened. And it just goes to show that maybe the real Crusades are the friends we made along the way. Or something like that. Thank you again to Private Internet Access for helping us make this video and keeping us safe online. To get their amazing deal and to support our channel, click the link in the description below, or go to piavpn.com/serioushistory.